He once tamed the wildest horses with nothing but a whisper. But after that night, he vanished. No more voices. No more family. Not even a mirror to face himself. Until a Mustang arrived, untamed, unpredictable, and carrying the same silence he once knew too well. When their eyes met, something ancient stirred, not fear, not rage, but recognition. This isn't a story about breaking a wild horse. It's the story of how that wild soul helped a broken man remember what it means to be alive. And if you stay, you may just feel it too. Because sometimes, healing begins not with answers, but with a memory. A memory like a wild horse, restless, untamed, and waiting to return. The man no longer kept mirrors in his house. One look into a horse's eyes was enough to see himself laid bare. Lucas Grant lived in a land where no one stopped anymore. The wind didn't sing. The earth didn't bloom. And memory, like a wild horse, still wandered restless in his mind each night. Some said he once had a family. Others claimed he killed horses without blinking. Only Rango knew the truth. Because only when facing an unbroken soul did Lucas begin to remember who he used to be. They once said Lucas was the man who whispered to horses, and the horses listened. Back then, ranches from Texas to Montana passed his number around like gospel. He was front-page material. Even the kids who saw him place a hand on a panicked stallion and watched it calm within minutes carried a piece of that moment like a pocket-sized legend. But memory is a beast no rope can hold. It doesn't break. It crushes. And it crushed Lucas. 10 years ago, on a desolate stretch of road in the Bighorn Basin, a runaway horse flipped the truck. His wife and daughter never made it out. The Appaloosa that caused the crash? Lucas had raised it since it was less than a week old. Since then, Lucas had let no man and no beast come close. He didn't believe in right or left anymore, only in wrong and punishment. Every scar on his heart was packed deeper with leather and silence. Then one day, the county sent him a creature labeled dangerous. That was the first time he heard the name. Rango. The Mustang arrived in a steel trailer, half wild. Eyes sharp as broken glass. When the door swung open, it thrashed so hard. The ramp groaned and the walls buckled. But when Lucas stepped forward, it stood still and stared. In that fleeting moment, Lucas felt something he hadn't in years. Exposed. The eyes didn't accuse. They didn't flinch. They simply said, "I know who you are. And I know what you're running from." Lucas said nothing. He just shook his head, maybe at the horse, maybe at himself. And that's when the real story began. In the early days, Lucas kept Rango in the deepest stall of the ranch. It was where he used to train the ones already broken in. Horses that understood the sting of a whip and the sound of their own name. But Rango was nothing like them. Every morning, when Lucas stepped out, Rango was already standing there. Still. Staring. As if time meant nothing. As if hunger had no hold. As if the only thing that mattered was knowing what Lucas would do next. Lucas lifted the whip, but didn't strike. He only spun it through the air. Rango didn't flinch. His ears twitched toward the crack of leather, but his body didn't budge. No recoil. No charge. Just stillness rooted to the ground. Like an old tree before a storm. Lucas turned to leave. But just as he stepped away, a sound broke the silence behind him. A whinny. The first in days. Soft. Almost quiet. Then Rango darted sharply to the right, kicking up a tall heap of straw. Lucas froze. It felt like the first time he'd seen the horse move by choice. Not out of panic. Not out of defiance. But something simpler. Clearer. I'm still here. I want to see what you'll do. Lucas turned back and stepped slowly into the stall, where the straw still lay scattered from Rango's earlier kick. He placed one hand on the top rail, standing there longer than usual, just watching him. I've seen ones like you before, Lucas murmured, but never quite like this. As he walked away, the sound of straw settling filled the silence. And in that soft rustling, Rango must have heard something close to real. That Lucas Grant was finally facing something he hadn't believed in for a long, long time. Faith. Lucas wasn't used to waiting. But the next morning, as he stepped out of the house, the first thing he saw was Rango still there. Same stance. Same stare. No retreat. No advance. No screaming. No fear. Just presence. Stubborn. Solid. Like stone carved from silence. And every day after that, it stayed the same. Lucas started with the methods he knew. The ones people once called quickly effective. He brought out the whip, the ropes, the saddle, the narrow pen, the gates. He isolated Rango from every living creature. No herd. No echo of hoofs. No soft grass or gentle gaze. Only the clash of iron and the scent of cold smoke. Rango didn't rear. Didn't collapse. He just stood there, those black eyes like the mouth of a memory Lucas couldn't walk into. He had hoped the horse would fight back. Because if it fought, at least he'd know how to respond. But Rango didn't fight. He resisted with silence. And that silence wasn't rebellion, it was rejection. Not of commands, but of Lucas's very authority to give them. Just like how Lucas had once gone silent with the world after he lost everything. And in those moments, Lucas felt as if he were staring into a mirror, one cast from a much younger, much lonelier version of himself. One late afternoon, as Lucas lifted the rope to begin again, a flicker of memory flashed before him. A little girl. Blonde hair. Eyes the color of late sun. Clutching an Appaloosa he once called the meanest damn horse in the barn. She said, Lucas whispered, to himself or to the shadow in the stall, he wasn't sure. Horses have souls, just like people. If one doesn't listen, maybe it's because we haven't learned to speak its language yet. Rango didn't move. That night, Lucas dreamed. For the first time in years, he saw his daughter's face, smiling. Not riding the old Appaloosa, but astride Rango. Her hair danced in the wind, and the white of her dress curled like brushstrokes across a field of wild purple flowers. Rango galloped, not wild, not untamed, but with a warmth, a grace. Something that felt almost like home. Lucas woke drenched in sweat, but his chest light as air. And in that fragile moment, he began to wonder, maybe it wasn't the horse that needed to be broken. Maybe it was the man. The one who had locked his own soul away for over a decade. Who truly needed to be saved. The next morning, Lucas didn't bring the whip. He didn't bring the ropes. Just himself. And a saddle. He placed it outside the stall. Let it sit there. Not as a threat. Not as a tool. But as a question. Rango sniffed it once. Then looked away. Lucas didn't push. Didn't even step closer. He just stayed. Leaning against the rail. Watching the wind pick up bits of straw and carry them into the light. And for a brief second, Rango looked at him, not through him. Not like a ghost. But like, maybe, a presence. The look didn't last. But it was enough. Enough for Lucas to try again the next day. And the next. And the next. The breakthrough didn't come with a dramatic leap or a sudden change. It came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Lucas placed the saddle on the ground again. This time, he stepped just a little closer. Rango didn't back away. He didn't move toward it either. But he didn't flinch. Lucas reached out slowly, no rope in hand, no halter, just the open space between them. His fingers hovered near Rango's neck. And then, like a breeze that didn't stir a leaf, they made contact. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't some mythical bond. It was skin, and warmth, and breath. Rango stood still, as if testing the meaning of the touch. Lucas didn't move. He let the contact speak its own quiet language. A minute passed. Then two. Then Rango exhaled, deep, slow, and low. The kind of breath that says, "I'll allow this." Lucas didn't smile. He didn't even breathe. But he felt it. Somewhere deep. Something like a door unlocking. And so, the saddle didn't go on that day. Nor the day after. But Lucas kept showing up. And Rango kept standing there. And little by little, silence became familiarity. Familiarity became presence. Presence became trust. The storm came 3 days later. Not the kind that rolls in with thunder and rain, though the sky did turn gray, and the wind howled through the cottonwoods like a song full of warning. It started with a sound. A loud metallic crack. A hinge coming loose on the far pasture gate. A sudden rush of motion. And one of the younger ranch hands, new, eager, clumsy, ran across the open yard waving his arms. Startled by the commotion, Rango bolted. Not toward the gate, not toward the fields, but toward the fence near the house, the only space he'd never crossed before. Lucas, inside, heard the crash and ran out. What he saw wasn't a wild horse escaping. It was a soul in full retreat, one that had dared to hope, only to be reminded that hope could be shattered. Lucas called his name. Not yelled, called. Like you'd call to someone you knew once but were afraid had forgotten you. Rango! The horse skidded to a halt. Turned halfway. Ears twitching. Eyes wide. Lucas took one step forward. No saddle. No rope. Nothing but rain starting to fall and a heart open just enough to crack. "I'm still here," Lucas whispered. And Rango blinked. Shook his mane. And took one step back toward the man who didn't flinch anymore. That night, they stood together under the lean-to. The storm passed slow and low, but neither of them moved. There were no words. Only breath, and hooves shifting in the dirt, and the kind of silence that felt less like emptiness, and more like beginning. The first ride didn't start with a saddle. It started with a brush. Lucas brought it up before sunrise. The barn was still and full of soft dust motes dancing in the early light. Rango stood in the far corner, as always, alert but calm. Lucas didn't speak. Just held out the brush in the open. Slowly, deliberately. Then he stepped closer. One stroke. Then another. The brush moved in long, steady lines across Rango's shoulder. Rango shifted slightly, not in protest, but as if adjusting to a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Lucas brushed in silence, his hands sure, his breath steady. The old motions came back like muscle memory, except this time, there was no goal. No audience. No training schedule. Just the two of them, surrounded by the hum of the waking world. After a while, Lucas left the brush on the fence. He didn't try to tack up. Didn't test the boundary. The next day, he brought the blanket. Held it out. Waited. Watched. And Rango, after a long stillness, stepped forward. Just once. Lucas laid the blanket over his back. No resistance. No tension. He waited a beat longer. Then removed it. Each day built on the last. The saddle came after a week. He didn't cinch it tight. Just let it rest, like a question whispered rather than declared. Rango didn't flinch. Lucas smiled, just barely. It felt foreign on his face. And then, one morning, he stood beside the horse, placed his hand on the pommel, and paused. Rango turned his head, "One I'm eating is." Lucas exhaled. And swung a leg over. No explosion. No fight. Just a breathless quiet, and the creak of worn leather. They didn't move for a full minute. The wind stirred. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. Then Lucas touched his heel to Rango's side. And Rango walked. It wasn't a march. It wasn't a performance. It was grace. And trust. And the kind of movement that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Lucas didn't cry. But something inside him did. And for the first time in a long, long while, he let it. The threat didn't look like much at first. Just a white government truck pulling up the gravel road one morning, dust trailing like a snake behind it. Two men in canvas jackets stepped out. Not hostile, not loud. Just official. Lucas knew the look. Bureau of Land Management. Wild Horse Division. They had the papers. They had the deadline. They had orders. And Rango, they said, was still technically unbroken. Still listed under high-risk category. Still tagged for permanent relocation. Lucas read the fine print. The euphemisms. He knew what relocation meant. It meant disappearance. One of the men, gray-haired, eyes tired but not cruel, spoke softer when Lucas didn't answer. "You've done more than we expected, Mr. Grant. But this horse, he wasn't supposed to come back. This was just a courtesy visit. He's already flagged." Lucas said nothing. They gave him a week. A week. The next 7 days passed like glass beneath bare feet. Every moment became sharper. Every glance heavier. Lucas fed Rango by hand now. Brushed him twice a day. Sat with him at dusk, watching shadows stretch long across the paddock. He didn't talk to anyone. Not the neighbors. Not the hands. Not even to himself. Only Rango. And Rango listened. On the 5th day, Lucas walked out just before dawn. No rope. No halter. He opened the gate and stood back. "Go," he whispered. "If you want to." Rango stepped forward. Stopped. Then looked at him. Not past him. Not around him. At him. And didn't move. Lucas swallowed hard. The sunrise crept over the hills behind him, brushing gold across Rango's coat. The gate remained open, but neither of them crossed it. The final warning came with frost on the grass. The kind that crunches under boots and hangs in the air like breath waiting to speak. Lucas was already up. Hadn't slept. He stood by the fence, hands in his coat pockets, watching Rango move slow and steady across the paddock. The truck was due at noon. He didn't know what he would do. He only knew what he couldn't. Couldn't say goodbye. Couldn't give up. Around mid-morning, Lucas walked to the barn. Grabbed an old leather halter, the one that had belonged to his daughter's first horse. It was worn, but still strong. He returned to Rango. Held it out. "This isn't for control," he said. "It's for choice." Rango sniffed it. Waited. Then lowered his head. Lucas slid it on. No resistance. They walked together, step by step, to the gate. The same gate Lucas had opened 2 days before. But this time, it wasn't open. Not yet. Lucas reached for the latch. And paused. He turned to Rango. "Once I open this," he whispered, "it's not about permission. It's about trust." He lifted the latch. Swung the gate wide. And waited. Rango looked past the fence. At the fields. At the sky. Then back at Lucas. And didn't move. A white truck appeared at the ridge. The same one from a week ago. Dust trailing behind it. Lucas closed his eyes. Held his breath. Then he felt it. A nudge. Soft. Steady. Rango's nose pressed to his shoulder. And Lucas finally exhaled. The truck reached the gate. The men stepped out. Lucas raised a hand. "He stays." The gray-haired man looked at Rango, then at Lucas. And after a long moment, nodded. No clipboard. No argument. Just a nod. And they drove away. Lucas turned to Rango, his voice a little shaky. "You chose to stay." Rango didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some loyalty is louder than any chain. The days after the decision felt like a dream. Rango grazed calmly, followed Lucas with quiet understanding, and responded to his commands with a grace that seemed earned, not forced. But trust, like glass, is beautiful and fragile. It happened during a routine training session. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. Until it was. Rango hesitated at a command. Lucas, already short on sleep and wrung out from the emotional toll of the past week, reacted without thinking. He shouted. Loud. Sharp. Then the whip cracked. And it didn't just cut air. It lashed Rango's flank, drawing blood. A red line across the muscle that had once carried a child in a dream. The moment stretched like pulled wire. Rango reared. His scream was not of pain, but betrayal. He lashed out with his hind legs, one of them connecting with Lucas's side. A crack. A breathless collapse. Lucas hit the ground hard. He felt his ribs give way. Air fled his lungs. Rango stomped once. Twice. Then backed away. Eyes wide. Breathing fast. Blood and dust and betrayal hanging heavy in the air. And then he ran. Straight through the side gate. Cracking the wood. Splinters flying. Gone. Lucas woke up hours later in the back of his truck. The pain in his side screamed with every breath. A ranch hand had found him and hauled him there. The local doc said cracked ribs, internal bruising. Nothing fatal. But something else had shattered that day. Something Lucas had only just begun to rebuild. He didn't wait to heal. Didn't wait for permission. That night, Lucas loaded his old tranquilizer rifle, started the truck, and drove into the dark. He told no one. He didn't need a map, because he knew where wild things went when they were wounded. Rango didn't run blindly. He knew the mountains, the old canyons, the places where snow lingered even in spring. Lucas followed tracks through pine forest, over icy creeks, across ridges that seemed carved by gods and forgotten by man. The chase lasted 2 days. Then 3. Then 4. Lucas's ribs ached. His hands shook. But his eyes stayed sharp. Until the 5th night. The truck hit a rock on a narrow mountain trail. Lucas veered hard to avoid rolling. The wheel jerked. The tires caught on loose gravel. And the world tilted. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. Then silence. Lucas crawled from the wreckage. Bleeding. Half-conscious. His breath like smoke in the freezing air. He staggered forward. 2 steps. Then the earth gave way. And he fell. Down into blackness. In the cold silence below, Lucas didn't feel pain anymore. Only weightlessness. Then came the dream. He was a horse. Trapped. Not just in a stall, but inside himself. A place with walls too close. No air. No light. He saw a man holding a whip. The man was shouting. Angry. Afraid. And the man was him. Lucas woke with a gasp. His body screaming from the fall. Blood on his lips. Snow beneath his back. But his heart, wide open. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, half buried in snow and silence. Long enough to forget the pain. Long enough to remember why he was chasing the horse in the first place. Not to catch him. Not to tame him. But to ask forgiveness. And then there was a sound. Hooves. Cautious. Measured. Close. Lucas opened one swollen eye. Through the blur of white and red, he saw a shadow moving between the trees. A shape he knew by heart. Rango. The horse stepped forward, inch by inch, his breath fogging in the cold air. His coat was matted with snow, his eyes wild, but clear. He found Lucas. And Lucas, broken and bleeding, managed a single whisper. "I'm sorry." Rango didn't run, didn't turn. He stood there, then lowered his head. The halter still hung from his neck. Lucas hadn't noticed until now. With great effort, Lucas reached up. His hand shook. Rango didn't move. Fingers touched fur. A shiver passed through both of them. Then, slowly, impossibly, Rango knelt. Lucas stared. Not believing. Not at first. But it was real. Rango knelt in the snow beside him, offering his body, his warmth. Lucas used the last of his strength to pull himself closer, over Rango's back, into place. And then, the horse rose. Together, they climbed. Out of the gully. Through the trees. Back to the world. It took hours. But they made it. The ranch hands found them just outside the lower pasture. Lucas unconscious. Rango standing guard. The legend would grow in the years to come. They would say the man saved the horse, or that the horse saved the man. But those who were there, the ones who saw, knew the truth. They saved each other. And in that truth, something old was reborn. A bond not of ownership, but of trust, of wild loyalty, of second chances, of freedom. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind clung to everything. Lucas awoke with a start. His body screamed, but his eyes blurred not from pain, from tears. The snow beneath him was packed where something heavy had stood all night. There, just a few feet away, was Rango. Standing still. Breathing slow. He had not left. He had come back. And stayed. Lucas didn't speak. He couldn't. Not yet. He simply stared at the animal that once took his blow and returned with loyalty. There was no logic to it. Only something sacred. Lucas, for the first time in decades, wept without shame. Not for the pain in his ribs, but for the pain he had carried too long in silence. And Rango, he watched. Not like an animal. Like something older than instinct. Something closer to a witness. Lucas didn't ask for forgiveness. He offered it, through his eyes. And Rango blinked, once. Then turned his gaze to the rising sun. In the weeks that followed, Lucas changed. The old paddocks were torn down. Not out of spite, but because they no longer belonged. The stalls were emptied. The whips burned. He built, instead, a new kind of space. Wide. Open. Quiet. Not a corral. Not a prison. A sanctuary. And he didn't call it anything. Didn't claim ownership. Didn't post signs or stake fences. It was just a place where horses wandered, and men were welcome only if they knew how to listen. Rango didn't stay inside the new fences, but he didn't leave either. Some mornings, Lucas would see him in the distance, standing at the ridge, watching. A figure caught between belonging and freedom. He never came closer than he wanted to. and Lucas never called him. He didn't need to, because sometimes healing isn't about coming back. It's about knowing you can and choosing to stay nearby. Some nights, Lucas would leave the porch light on, not because he expected anyone, but because a part of him hoped. One evening, under a deep indigo sky, he stepped outside and found Rango standing by the broken post where the old gate used to hang. No saddle. No rope. No sound. Just presence. Lucas walked forward, slow. Rango didn't move. They stood there for a while, both silent. Then Lucas, with a breath that trembled, whispered, "You don't owe me anything." And in the stillness, something shifted, not between them, but within Lucas. He was no longer waiting for Rango to come back. He was learning to live with the space Rango chose to fill. The sanctuary became a place others noticed. A neighbor dropped by with a retired mare. Then a young couple with a blind colt. Lucas didn't say no. He didn't say much at all. He simply opened the gate. Word spread. A vet from Laramie sent an anxious thoroughbred. A farrier donated hay. A child brought a sketch of Rango and left it tucked in the gate. Lucas never advertised. He didn't write the word rescue on anything. But something about the place said, "You can stay here if you need time." And the ones who stayed, the animals, the people, taught Lucas more than he had ever learned from taming. They taught him how to wait, how to trust, how to release. One morning, while checking the north fence line, Lucas found hoof prints beside his own boot tracks. Fresh ones. He followed them. Over the ridge. Down by the stream. Into the trees. There was Rango. Lying in a patch of sun. Not hurt. Not sick. Just resting. He looked up. Blinked. Then closed his eyes again. Lucas didn't approach. He simply sat down nearby. Back to a tree. Hands in the dirt. And the two of them shared that silence, the kind only those who've been broken and forgiven can understand. That winter, more horses came. A storm rolled in early, harsh and uninvited. The sanctuary became a safe harbor not just for animals, but for people caught between storms of their own. A woman with silver hair and tired eyes arrived with a mule she said had once belonged to her late husband. She didn't ask for help. Just stood at the gate. Lucas let her in. They didn't talk much. But sometimes, healing happens in proximity, not words. One morning, the mule stood beside Rango under a bare cottonwood, both motionless, like statues carved from memory. Lucas watched from the porch, coffee in hand, heart lighter than the sky. Another time, a school group visited, a mistake, Lucas thought. Too loud. Too chaotic. But in the middle of the noise, a boy broke away. He didn't speak. Just walked, slow and certain, toward the ridge. And Rango met him there. The boy didn't pet him. Didn't try to climb or lead or touch. He just stood. And Rango did too. Lucas didn't interrupt. He only watched. And later, when the bus had gone and the field was quiet again, he found a note tucked into the gate latch. "Thank you for letting me be near something that didn't need me to fix it." Lucas folded the note. Placed it in the old coffee tin where he kept quiet things that mattered. Spring came late. But when it did, the land changed fast, like it had just been waiting for permission. Grass grew tall and soft. Wildflowers spilled along the fence line. Birds nested in the rafters of the old barn. And one evening, Lucas took down the last of the old signs, "Keep out." He didn't replace it with anything. Just open space. And the sound of hoofbeats returning, not because they were called, but because they chose to come back. The story of the sanctuary spread quietly, like the scent of rain before a storm. No flashy headlines. No viral videos. Just word of mouth, passed from rancher to ranger, from child to elder. And then, one day, a journalist showed up. She was young, polite, curious, but not invasive. Her recorder stayed in her bag. Her questions were thoughtful. She asked about the horses, about the land, about the man who had once been known for breaking them. Lucas didn't answer much at first. He didn't like cameras, didn't trust angles. But eventually, on a wind-stilled morning, she asked him, "How did you train that Mustang?" Lucas was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at the ridgeline, where Rango often stood like a sentinel carved from dust and time. And he answered, "I didn't train him." He smiled faintly. "I learned to listen to him." A pause. Then softer. "And he trained my heart in return." The article never went viral. It didn't need to. But those who read it, really read it, found something else within the lines, a truth not shouted, but whispered. That not all healing comes with noise. And not all victories were medals. Some come in the form of a silent nod across a field. A hoofprint beside your boot. A scar that doesn't ache when it rains. That summer, more horses came. But Lucas had stopped counting. The sanctuary no longer felt like a project. It felt like an answer. And one evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Lucas sat on the grassy ridge. Hat off. Hair tousled by the wind. Hands calloused, but still. Rango stood in the distance, by the herd. He looked back. Not for long. Just enough. And then he ran. Toward the open land. Toward the wild. Toward the only kind of freedom worth having, the one you choose for yourself. Lucas watched. Not with sorrow, but with peace. The wind carried the sound of hooves over the valley like a heartbeat, not of a man, not of a beast, but of something older, wiser, and free. Because true freedom cannot be forced. Because healing doesn't come from control. Because even the broken deserve a chance to choose their own sky.